Darrell Issa, the politician. Government and businesses are intertwined. How does someone with an entrepreneurial background mesh their talents with the government's role as regulator? No other city has had such a tumultuous relationship with the government as Las Vegas. After all, they don't call it Sin City for nothing. From its shady business origins to its rise as an entertainment metropolis, Vegas is in many ways a microcosm of aspects of the American commercial landscape. Few better understand the complicated relationship between business and government than former Congressman Darrell Issa. Issa served 18 years in Congress as a Republican from California, rising to a position of prominence as chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He also happens to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars from his time as CEO of Directed Electronics, a major player in car security products. After deciding not to seek re-election in 2018, Issa was named Director of the United States Trade and Development Agency, and I sat down with him to tap into his insights from a long and unparalleled experience with markets, trade, and regulation. I asked you a little bit about how, historically education was this great equalizer. And education may still be, but between the debt that many students incur, it actually kind of diverges the rich from the poor. What are your thoughts on the state of education in the U.S.?
Well, education is the greatest failure, essentially, in the modern economy. And the reason I say that is that if you look at the two items that have led inflation, education, healthcare. Now, healthcare could be number one, except that healthcare has improved. What we're getting in the way of an output product, your chances of surviving cardiac problems or cancer are dramatically improved. So we get a return on that, even though it has led inflation. Education, particularly in higher education, where you mentioned the debt, has led inflation for my entire life. At K through 12, it's been primarily unionization. Teachers teach less, charge more, and don't necessarily have smaller class sizes, aren't necessarily less stressed. But we spend, depends on the state, $10,000 to as much as $15,000 or $16,000 per student, and typical classes of 30. So you're looking at $250,000, $250,000, if you will, all the way up to $400,000 per classroom. Now, the teacher receives a large portion of that. The inefficiency, the bureaucracy, all those bureaucrats, counselors and administrators, all have been piled onto the system. So when you look at that, you say, wait a second, basic K through 12 education is almost unchanged from Ben Franklin to today, and yet the cost has been going up. You then get to higher education. Teachers, universities, particularly our premier universities, are much more interested in research projects and other writing books. Their actual time spent teaching has gone down while their pay has gone up. And this is particularly important if you look at a classic liberal arts. We could make a case for STEM that some things cost more today, and those are important things. But for the most part, if you really look at it, if somebody graduates with a typical liberal arts degree, again, it isn't a lot different than when Ben Franklin was alive. And yet the cost in constant dollars has gone up. So those who want to say that there's this inequity, the disparity, the high debt, aren't looking at what's caused it. And I think for everybody who wants to fix the problem, of course you have to change our environment. You know, the reason that Asians, both Indians and Chinese, outperform other minorities is that they push and they incentivize their children, they're driven. That's part of the problem. Certainly, we could talk about a lot of other areas, but if you can make education more modern, more efficient, more affordable, then you in fact reduce that disparity, because education is still the equalizer.
It is. So what's interesting about your background is you actually had a successful run as an entrepreneur, right? So what are some of the things that are similar and different from business through the lens of entrepreneurship versus, the entrepreneurial spirit you need to run for office and then operate in that framework?
There's a lot less in common between corporate America and business than you'd think, and that's unfortunate.
Between corporate America and business?
I'm sorry, I apologize.
That's fine.
There's a lot less different between if you will, business and corporate America and government.
Got it.
The only similarity would be in very large bureaucratic businesses. If you go to a large company, let's just use General Motors as an example.
I was going to say GE.
Or GE, currently in the spotlight. They have a strong tendency to talk about budgets and have budget meetings and be judged based on hitting budget goals. Well, smaller entrepreneurial businesses, if they see an opportunity and they have the resources, they'll feed everything they can into success. And if they see something that isn't working, they'll quickly pull back the money. That sort of flexibility doesn't exist in government, sometimes doesn't exist in large companies, and that creates tremendous waste. And waste is inherently the difference between, if you will, private sector answers and, if you will, socialist answers. And when you and I were talking before we came on set, we talked about this view of socialism versus capitalism. The argument over socialism is that government is somehow better and will do better for you, and it's fairer. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the great socialists of all time, he believed in socialism, he believed in government, and he built large government systems, and none of them performed well on a cost benefit. The other interesting thing is he believed that government was so benign that it should never be unionized. He opposed unionization of government. And yet in our environment, the largest pocket of unionization and the inefficiency that comes with labor unions is the government at all levels. So again, what you really see is when you go into government service, like a congressman, you're fighting private sector empowerment versus government. But the government unions, the government bureaucracy actually has so much power that it is self-perpetuating.
So you mentioned unions a few times and also in the previous conversation. Do you view unions as necessary evil, something else? What are your thoughts on?
Well, as a proud member of the Teamsters and the Machinists Union, which is part of the AFL-CIO, private sector unions still continue to have an important role. They can be misguided. They can demoralize competition in the U.S., or they can, in fact, be part of long-term benefit and have the best interest of the company's success so that their employees have a success. I was with UPS, and I can certainly tell you as a college student at UPS, the fact that we were union didn't change the fact that we knew that UPS was the successful alternative to the post office and other package carriers. And so, they're not inherently bad. But when, excuse me, what I was alluding to in the earlier conversation is when you don't have a P&L, take the post office, for example. It's been losing $7 billion a year. It has been only shrinking in labor force by a portion of its attrition. It hasn't increased its efficiency. As a matter of fact, it's one of the great laggards in energy efficiency because it won't invest the money, but it also won't reduce its labor in order to be able to have any investment capability. And yet, the unions are the strongest unions in the federal government. Are they helping the post office? No. As a matter of fact, the only people that benefit are the labor unions of the post office and the legacy workers, excuse me, and the legacy workers for a short time. Ultimately, the postal system should be the premier package delivery system, and yet it's being essentially passed by everyone, including Jeff Bezos' own delivery system. And so, again, I'm a fan of unions as long as their motivation and their accountability is the same as the enterprise and the worker.
Lots of interesting points. I want to segue in many. So why is it now that all of a sudden millennials are viewing socialism at 47%, 50% favorably? Is this an age thing that all generations, when they're younger, they're hippies, they rebel, and then eventually they get older, they get jobs, mortgages, or do you think, no, there's been a systematic change, whether it's 9/11, whether it's the 2008 economic, whatever, like the Lehman blowout? Have things changed where you're seeing this inflection point where, I'm not saying we're going to become the USSR, but have things changed, or it's just, no, this is always...
I believe it was Churchill that had the famous quote about if you're not liberal when you're young. Uh, Ultimately, what makes people believe in government is that they don't really know where the money comes from. Once you know where the money comes from for government, and you realize that the round trip from your pocket to government and back to you has huge shrinkage, you start asking the question of, well, why couldn't myself, my local government, private enterprise do this and do it with less shrinkage? At the end of the day, if you take care of your children, it costs X. If you have your neighbor take care of them, you're going to pay a little more. But by the time you give the federal government the ability to take care of your children, you find a huge bureaucracy in Washington that consumes a major portion of what you thought was going to take care of your children.
Do you feel like there is this specter haunting America, or do you think that the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes and the Bernie Sanders are these legitimately politicians who are going to become leaders of the party and possibly the nation?
Ronald Reagan famously said that liberals aren't stupid; they just know things that aren't true. Bernie Sanders and AOC are leaders, and they are moving their party toward mistakes that have been made before. They'll be made again. Margaret Thatcher had to take her country back from the edge of complete insolvency because it had become so socialistic and so inefficient that this little island was losing competition quickly. And a whole generation has benefited from it. Ronald Reagan made a change in direction of our country in a meaningful way that has allowed us to be globally competitive for a generation. We will again experiment with government programs. There's no question at all. But ultimately, government will do the best it can, and it won't be as good as you'll get through other means. Redistribution of wealth, taking from the rich, 70% punitive taxes or higher, these sort of hateful things have been around for a long time. And yet the AOCs don't understand, and they will never understand. And Bernie Sanders, who has a net worth of over $1 million, will probably never understand that it's the accumulation of capital and the ability to put it to work, that whether it's small amounts from many or large amounts from a few, that have in fact fueled our economy for a generation. When you look at capitalism, the best part of capitalism is money flowing toward potentially and accountably effective projects that benefit society. And it does it better than the Soviet Union, or there would still be a Soviet Union.
I mean, I was born in Iran in '78. 6 months later, there was a revolution. So we were very fortunate.
Timing's everything.
Timing's everything. And then so we moved to Canada, and Canada's great, but I still say Canada may be the best place to live, but the US is probably the best overall place to build a business and do, many other things. So
a Toronto winter, I might disagree with
No, I agree
that
with you
too.
that's the thing. If you can put up with we're not talking weather here. So is the U.S., like basically when President Trump, who you've been a staunch supporter of, I don't think you fundamentally...
No, I believe in his policies, and I believe that many of the people are doing some Herculean tasks that needed to be done. Department of Labor, Department of Education, they're making major reforms to try to make our economy and our education system work better.
The policies of this president, I want to have in my district because I believe in him. Justice Gorsuch, I'm happy he's on the bench. I think the people in my district who did vote for me have some doubts at times about certain aspects of the president's behavior, but I'll tell you something. They don't have any question that he's appointed good people to serve, and they're trying to do their job. And so when I look at my district, which is a high-tech, high-skilled district that wants to see successes, I'm going to be more interested in making sure that if I'm going to have an argument with the president, it's going to be making sure that we continue better free trade with more trade and other issues.
But do you feel that the criticism of America, was in the word wreckage? He used the word in his, when he took the presidency. Do you feel like America's best days are ahead of it, basically, or do you feel like its best days are behind it? And also not just the context of the U.S., but also relative to other places in the world with the emerging markets and whatnot.
The world's best days are ahead of it. and the future is bright because America is in fact a leader for good. If you take the period before there was the United States of America, before this democracy began flexing around the world was not moving nearly as fast in an economically good direction, and peace was much more elusive. We have been a stabilizing influence for peace. We have promoted prosperity and private ownership. If you look at the beginning of our country, and you come from Iran, where the government decides what you own, and you don't own the oil wells, you don't own the greatest wealth producer. The fact is, private ownership, you can take the Chilean model, can over a very short period of time move people to work harder and to work more effectively because they get a benefit from it. When I was a young man studying the Soviet and the communist system, both in high school and then in college in economics, we were studying what worked in the Soviet Union. And what worked in the Soviet Union wasn't communism. It was when they started issuing out small plots of land and letting somebody who was working in the collective for a certain amount of time have a little piece of land that they could call their own, feed their family, and sell at a weekend market. Even in Israel, where the famous kibbutzes, the ultimate in communism, if you will, were operational, they had to incentivize those sort of things in order to give people the opportunity to excel over the lazy among them. That's human nature. And if socialism really worked, all of those countries would have done more of it. Bibi Netanyahu has fought socialism to make the economy of Israel more effective. Chile changed its direction for better by allowing private ownership. And countries that still deny private ownership and reasonable accumulation of capital always lag other countries.
So to be fair, I don't disagree with the point you're making, but to be fair, it's more hypothetical going forward. When Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he did not envision a pre-industrial country like Russia and the USSR to adopt communism. He had envisioned it more for like an industrial nation like Germany. Hypothetically, if you would have taken some of that philosophy and applied it to a country like Germany, do you think it would have made any difference? Or the fact that it doesn't really matter, that's like a detail?
Well, I think if you look at communism in East Germany and the reunification, the disparity between them and the speed with which the East Germans, well, still being socialist at heart, adopted at least some of what was necessary to double their per capita GDP in a matter of a decade. You have a perfect example. The Germans east of the Berlin Wall, or east of the line in Eastern Germany, and those west started off virtually identical. West Germany had a GDP, per capita GDP, that was more than double East Germany at the time of reunification. That is the perfect model of an industrial nation with great capability and a study of who succeeded and who didn't. You can have a similar study in Czechoslovakia, where under Simunek, they began liberalizing, and the Soviets were so threatened by the economic renaissance that was going on that in 1968, they drove tanks in to stop it. If you wanted to have another model, and a model of, if you will, government, not necessarily socialism, but government, the island that we know as Haiti / the Dominican Republic, the difference between the dividing line of two government systems is developing nation and undeveloped nation living in adverse poverty. Governments make a difference, and governments do not make a difference for better just because they want socialism. They make a difference because they allow the human spirit to work for itself, and then as a result, for its neighbors.
Yeah, that image of the border between Haiti and Dominican is something else. So you've alluded now a couple times to this concept of the unreasonable accumulation of capital. Do you view that as like an existential threat to the system of the United States, or do you think it's life, that's capitalism, survival of the fittest, so to speak?
There's no accumulation as a percentage of our country that is a fraction of what it was nearly 100 years ago. In other words, the richest people in the world in measured dollars are richer, but in a percentage of our, for example, national debt. Rockefeller had enough money to pay off our national debt. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and everyone they know together couldn't pay off the national debt with 100% of their wealth. So when we look at a company worth $1 trillion, that's not the individual. When we look at people who are worth 50 or $100 billion, no question at all, they're going to create huge legacies. Our government is going to take 40% of their wealth, any portion they haven't put into a charitable foundation that is in fact giving it away forever, they're going to take 40% of it. So we don't allow accumulation of great wealth as a percentage of our economy, and I think those who want to look at the numbers are missing the comparative numbers.
So I understand the point you're making vis-a-vis percentage of debt, but in terms of like the percentage that the 1%
Well, percentage of GDP would be just as much. You know, everyone can look at that, but you know, let's take, for example, what was our founding father, a billionaire. George Washington in today's dollars would be a billionaire. His money was almost all in land, although he had a perfectly good still that made quite a bit of money. You can still get his rye. But the fact is that he had huge land holdings, which, to be honest, was to the exclusion of people's ability to live anywhere except rented on his land and so on. And so the power of that billionaire in today's dollars was huge. Even if it hadn't been enslaved, even if it had been free men, it would have been a massive amount of disparity in every part of life and control. But now you look at a modern person. What does Jeff Bezos really have as you know, our richest man? He has the stock in a company that is actively investing every day, hiring and promoting huge amounts of workers. In other words, what he has is a paper earning, but at the end of the day, it is reinvested substantially. 99% of it plus is reinvested on a regular basis into the economy. So if you're looking for wealth that somehow doesn't benefit society, you have to be very careful and say, well, what is that wealth? Is it some sort of an idle item that does no one any good? A number of decades ago, there was the famous tax on yachts, and it destroyed the American yacht industry. And of course, it destroyed the American yacht industry builder and worker, and they reversed it because it turned out that the people who were buying their dream boat, whether it was a yacht of 100 feet or a yacht of 35 feet, were a big part of the economy. It employed a lot of people in important industry. And what we discovered was that that wasn't necessarily bad, that the person who wanted to buy their toy created an amazing amount of jobs. So I'm not defending, if you will, the idle rich. But the reality is today, the vast majority of anybody's money is not idle. It's invested not in agriculture, not in land that I force you to live on, but it's invested and reinvested. And I think here at the SALT conference, we're seeing exactly that. Many of the largest participants here are foundations, nonprofits, who are looking to increase the revenue, the invested money, both into our economy, but also into the ability to then help with areas in which government is letting down people, whether it's helping with the homeless, helping with education and the like. So when you want to bash the rich, the first thing you have to ask is how much of that wealth, that disparity, is actually somehow not benefiting society? Because I think once you do that, and then when you add the fact that over a relatively small amount, the super rich are being taxed at 40%, or they're putting their money permanently into the benefit of society. Either way, it's a redistribution that is far greater than our Constitution envisioned or our founding fathers would have tolerated.
He was unafraid to talk about compromise, to talk about if you will, the barrier. But I think, Maria, I think the important thing was he was making the case for national security, which is his issue. It is Syria and bringing the troops home. It's making sure that these peace is stable. It's talking about making sure that NATO has done that $100 billion and more of contribution that they wouldn't have done otherwise.
Which is a big deal.
It's going back to the China issue, and obviously he more than a little bit touched on the continued problems with Russia and having to pull out of a Reagan-era treaty because they've been cheating since Reagan.
So final topic question. So I called President Trump winning a year before he won. And set aside what you think of his policies. There's a lot of people who say the conduct is unbefitting of a president, that he wants to be a king, that Congress has to kind of provide some check and balance. And so I want your thoughts on that. Like, do you think that those criticisms are fair? Does he get a free pass that you would never really give anybody else? Is it embarrassing to the country to almost to that point? And finally, does President Trump win in 2020, in your opinion?
Well, let's take it in reverse order. President Trump wins in 2020 because America's winning. And the Americans will vote the success of his administration. And at least today, there's no question that the administration is delivering. So I think that's going to happen. When we talk about wanting to be a king, our first president, idolized by all of us, insisted on a gilded carriage and multiple horses. So he wasn't as humble as some historians would write. This president has enjoyed great wealth, already had a very nice jet before he came to Washington. I think when you look at his conduct, if it's embarrassing, is it Berlusconi embarrassing? Is it the Congresswoman who said we're going to impeach thee, and the words can't be repeated? Is it Chairman Nadler, who on a train said he was going to impeach the president, hadn't even taken office yet? There's plenty of conduct that I would wish would be more positive, more measured. But we didn't hire the president because he was a diplomat. The American people hired this president, the people of Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, places that didn't vote for George W. Bush either time, but were much more favorable. They did it because there were problems that were unresolved. Reagan famously was known for a few things. Government is too big, taxes are too high, criminals need to be punished, America needs to lead the world for safety and defense. He had those very basic items, and he believed in them, and he followed through on them. This president is following through on a number of areas in which his predecessors have let us down. North Korea has abused their people and starved their people for a couple of generations. Iran, where you come from, has been unfair to its own people since the revolution. And these have been tolerated, in some cases even funded, by people trying to appease those. This president has said, no, on my watch I will attempt to bring a final and lasting peace to the people of North Korea. I will not tolerate Iran building nuclear weapons and endangering it.
I associate myself more Canadian because I grew up in Canada. But I think if we're at a point where we're comparing the president of the United States to Iran and North Korea,
no,
I know you're not. No, I'm just to make a point.
No, I'm comparing his determination. Secretary Bill Cohen, a Republican, but a secretary for a Democrat administration, has made it very clear that what President Trump was doing in his support of the attempts to stop North Korea, not by appeasement, but by intolerance, by shutting down every part of their income, said, we have kicked the can down the road as long as we can. It has to stop at some point. On his watch, in the Clinton administration, they appeased. They gave him oil. They did everything thinking they were going to help them. They even helped build a cross-border industry. They tried other things and they failed. This president, in foreign policy and domestic policy and in trade policy, is looking at areas that have not succeeded, and he's willing to try things that are new. Is he brash? Yes. Does he be around many other institutions? Absolutely. But if you agree with his policies, as even Chuck Schumer has had to at times on China and so on, then what you have to do is ask the question, can we bifurcate two things? The fact that he's not a diplomat of the highest level, and the fact that we agree with the policies and we want America to succeed, because if America can succeed, the world can prosper. And that's really what it's all about, is will America lead in a way that the rest of the world will benefit from? If China stops stealing intellectual property, every European country benefits every bit as much as the United States. And the Europeans have told me that. But they've also told me they're going to keep selling product, essentially selling the rope that they're going to be hung with until we win, and then they're going to ask for the same deal. That's very European. It's very diplomatic. This president is not European, he's not diplomatic, but I agree with his policies, and when I disagree in nuances, it's not because he doesn't want what's best for America, it's because we disagree in nuances. You obviously, as a Canadian, still look to the Middle East, and you have opinions on Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump on their Middle East policy. Every one of those presidents has had failures. And the Middle East is no better after Jimmy Carter to Donald Trump. So one of the things that we all have to do is we all have to say, let's get behind the president and help him succeed where multiple presidents, I'm afraid, have failed.
Does this constant state of war ultimately help America? Because this generation has been brought up on Iraq, Afghanistan. Like, how does that help?
You know, it's a really good question of, are we better off today than we were 17 years ago? And the answer, of course, is we're not. We haven't yet figured out the puzzle. But of course, we didn't figure out the puzzle from the time of the Iranian Revolution, the destabilizing that had occurred in other Arab nations that began becoming more fundamentalist, almost in self-defense. We haven't figured out how to bring a two-state solution to the people of Palestine. So we have a lot of unresolved problems. I think that if you look at the period from, let's just say, 78 to 2001, and 2001 to now, if you actually look at how many people went to war, how much was being spent, and so on, it's actually more similar than not. The 1990-91 was certainly very expensive. We mobilized 500,000 people. It was a short war, but we didn't fix the problem. Taking out Saddam didn't fix the basic struggle between Shia and Sunni. But by the way, my family goes back to 600 AD, at least in Lebanon. As Christians in the Middle East, we lived under that problem for all that time and more. So the fact is, these are tough problems. And they're problems that won't be solved by a Republican president or a Democratic president. They'll be solved by good people engaging, and then maybe, just maybe, a little bit of luck in the region.
Doesn't help if he doesn't know the difference between the Sunni and the Shias, to quote that George Bush line. All right, on that note, we have to stop. It's been great chatting.